Why is it that a country born in such an enabling environment for democratic institutionalization lose its spirit, perhaps its way, and have to go through various gyrations and convolutions as it tried to negotiate state-society relations in a constantly changing landscape of fluid alliances, shifting loyalties, and cynical arrangements? Why is it that the religionist forces, that is, those using faith for political purposes, which were assumed to be defensive and moribund at one time? After all, the idea of religion as the basis for a state was rejected in 1971. And these forces faced considerable suspicion and exclusion. They were able to claw its way back into the body politic, become important players in the bargaining-based political arrangements, and eventually was able to affect public policy and personal conduct in fairly decisive ways. Why is it that different regimes were unable to instill popular confidence in their moral authority or civic legitimacy and failed to control violence, being expressed both at economic levels in ways that were individually frightening, as well as in organized and institutional levels in ways that are socially destabilizing and ominous? Why did goons and gangs, musclemen and bahinis become part of political strategies through various phases in the state's evolution? Today, we are fortunate to have three distinguished scholars exploring these and related questions and offering their perspectives, analysis, and judgments, and three equally respected academics as discussants on their presentations. The chair of the session is really the ornamental position of an elevated timekeeper, and I would sincerely appreciate the cooperation of all the participants in helping me and everyone else by remaining within time limits. All of us are aware of the basic housekeeping rules governing us today. As I indicated earlier, Dr. Fahmida Khatun will be our enforcer, and she can be very convincing. We should have at least 15 minutes for Q&A, and the questions and comments will be read by Dr. Fahmida Khatun so that she could read them out or indicate its gist, and relevant presenters could respond. At the end, there may even be a few minutes for my absolutely brilliant and scintillating remarks. The order of the presentations will follow the order in which they are printed in the program. Let me mention all the papers. The first paper will be on evolution of state-society relations in Bangladesh, an analytical narrative, by Dr. Mirza M. Hassan, head of the Governance and Politics Cluster, BRAC Institute of Governance and Development in Dhaka. And the discussant will be Professor Naomi Hussain, research professor, Accountability Research Center, School of International Services, American University in Washington, D.C. The second, let me mention all the papers that we're going to have today. The second paper, Islamist Politics in Bangladesh, the Nature, Scope, and the Pathway, will be presented by Professor Ali Riaz, Distinguished Professor, Department of Politics and Government, Illinois State University at Normal. The discussant will be Professor Habibul Khandakar, Professor at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. The third paper is entitled State-Making, Violence, and Political Muscle, Bangladesh as a Polycratic State, and will be presented by Professor Harold Engelson-Rude, Professor of South Asian Studies, University of Oslo, and the discussant will be Dr. Philip K. Goldenberg, Associate Professor of Political Science at Columbia University in New York. May I now request Professor Mirza Hassan to present his paper. He has 14 minutes, and after Dr. Hassan has ended, I would call on Dr. Naomi Hassan to comment. She would have 7 minutes, and then Dr. Hassan will have 4 minutes to respond. So please, Dr. Mirza Hassan.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. The slides, please. Okay, the next one. Well, this is the title, which has been already told. Can you move on? All I'm going to do here, I wrote a paper which is about the relationship between state and civil and the society in general. So because of to make it manageable, I had to pick and choose. So I covered associational realms like business, NGOs, and professionals, trade unions in their associational form, and also to see the state and the relationship between the unorganized citizens. I also looked at the popular classes, industrial workers, rural and urban poor, both generally and also within the invited spaces. These are the spaces offered by the local government where people can come and deliberate. For this particular session, I'm going to talk only about two state-society relations among two groups, state in business and state and the organized popular class, two very sharply contrasting cases. Let's move on. So the first thing, historically, is just a thumbnail sketch of the 50 years. Intermediate regime, 72, 75, the country started its political process as a dominant party state, characterized by a constrained form of pluralist politics. And then the defining feature was, in the absence of organized bourgeoisie or the working class, the focal point of the state-society relations was basically between the state and the intermediate classes. It's a motley assemblage of petty bourgeois classes, professionals, students, rich peasants, and so on. And that it formed a sort of coalition also. And the coalition of the state and the societal actors failed to produce a stable equilibrium that culminated in a Hobbesian world of politics with grave consequences for the political and social order of the dominant party state. To put it in very plain language, dominant party states are where one party calls the shot. Okay, there are technical fancy definition. I'm not going into that. And as a desperate attempt to contain the Hobbesian chaos involving the coalition and other opposing socio-political actors, and to realize the purported goal of socialist transformation of the economy and the society, the DPS abandoned the nominal form of liberal pluralist politics and morphed into a one-party state. Next one. The first military regime between 75 and 81, and the constrained pluralism, General President Zia BNP regime started between 1976 and 78. And then General Zia had to assume a Bonapartist role, to go above the classes and faction, because he had faced crisis, and it was another Hobbesian war. A new political order was emerging, eventually led by him. And there's a second phase, 1979 to early 1981. We saw again the new DPS, the dominant party system, in a dynamic context of less constrained pluralist politics. And at this moment, General Zia gave up his Bonapartist role and he embedded himself into the political and social networks in his quest for building an anti-Awami League political and societal coalition. But the most defining feature of the state-society relations involving both parties, BNP and Awami League, was the massive transformative social change that took place, the deep-seated political mobilization of the rural community. For BNP, it was quest for building the grassroots basis, and for Awami League to protect and nurture its existing community basis. And the way it was done in the two modes, one is the incorporative clientelistic mode, and the other one is the incorporative populistic strategy. The first strategy mobilizes citizens through inserting them into personalistic and highly particularistic patron-client networks. The second strategy mobilizes citizens into politics via the massive attachment to a leader whose charisma becomes the major source of legitimation. People aware of Bangladesh politics would know who am I talking about. Next one, please. Okay, and then we have General Isha, 1982 to 1990. He wasn't that lucky because, his rule can also be divided into two, 82 to 86 as a military rule, and then the dominant party system, again, heavily constrained by constrained form of pluralism. The defining feature at that time of the state-society relation was that he failed to develop hegemonic control over the society, over the organized civil society group. For two reasons. One is his personal image, but more than that, I think the two hegemonic parties he had as opponents, and he had no room to go for any kind of clientelistic incorporation in the society. And he had serious legitimacy deficits. Then we move to the actually existing democratic transition period between 91 and 2021. I'm calling it actually existing democratic transition, but I don't know how else to call it, as we'll see later. So it has two phases in the nature of political order. The first, 91 to 2006, we have the party systems characterized by competitive political settlement, CPS, and then we have the 2010-2021 as a dominant party settlement. 2009 missing, but at this stage, I think we had this, the enclave of CPS. And with the caretaker government gone in 2010, I kind of, think that, the dominant party settlement started right after that. And basically, CPS phase witnessed an incipient form of polyarchy, a pluralist form of political governance, but soon the evolution of the political order changed track, and a former party stage emerged that largely arrested the development of the polyarchy. And if you ask me the date, I would go for 1994 with the crisis of the by-elections and so on. Next one, please. In operationalizing the relationship between the state and the organized group of civil society, I'm using the term partyarchy, which essentially means party monopolizing state and societies, both state and societies and so on. And in Bangladesh, the way it developed, it had three types, basically. The one is the monopolistic, which is essentially covering the state. And then we have this duopolistic, where Awami League and BNP command loyalty of the members of most civil society associations. And in few instances, like in the trade union, in the area of, say, transport sector trade union, where you even have, left-wing parties commanding allegiance of the members. So we had a constrained pluralist form there. Next one, please. Okay, state and business. I've just moved into the case study. So back in the 70s and 80s, the collective forums of the business remained very weak and institutionally and politically, but in post-1991 phase, with we witnessed the gradual rise in political salience of the business association. Reasons being for political liberalization, of course. A more significant reason for this has been the economic liberalizations, privatization, and so on. There's a meta-level cognitive shift, thanks to the hegemony of the new liberal ideology over polite economy and society. And all those kind of fetishization of the business leaders. And if you can see, the elections on a BCCI are covered by the media as if national parliament elections going on. So all kinds of fetishization and so on of the bourgeois virtues as well. And the financial clout over electoral politics. So all these laid ground for this business forums to revamp its forums and to engage with state more confidently as a collective actor. And as it transpired, the business-state relations that emerged over the ensuing decades revealed the business community could hardly achieve the lofty ambitions that they set for themselves. As a starter, collective action process of the business has never been a non-partisan affair. The executive committees formed of the election tended to manifest a balanced composition of business leaders aligned to two parties, the logic of duopolistic partyarchy, a bit of a hedging strategy also on the part of the business since regime change through credible election due to third-party monitoring the caretaker, still remaining a possibility. But this situation proved to be short-lived because of larger political dynamics that sent signals to the political elites that the existing duopolistic settlement generates political uncertainty and needed to be replaced by the logic of monopolistic partyarchy. And then what we have seen, successive regimes were able to progressively monopolize the leadership of the association by ensuring that, for example, FBCCI's election reflect predetermined outcomes. Next one, please. And the CPS stage largely exhibited dynamics of clientelistic incorporation that started with Ziaur Rahman. The long shadow of that continues until now. And the transiting towards some kind of liberal pluralist order, as pluralist interest group theory would have predicted, that never happened in Bangladesh. And also it belied the modernization theory's principal assumption that the market actors given the opportunity will push for greater pluralism and also contribute to the erosions of particularism in the economy and society. That never happened. Fukuyama's end of history never arrived in Bangladesh. Now we move on to the post-2014 dominant party, which is the current one. The collective action dynamics of the business community seems to be significant impact. The patriarchal control over the prominent association appeared to have reached an unprecedented level, even in Bangladesh standard. For example, BGMA, which tried and could strategically maintained a duopolistic patriarchal arrangement in governing the forum, seems to have given up such posture, as they has embraced the patriarchal monopoly as fait accompli since 2009, and particularly since 2014. Move on, please. Next one. The reasons, of course, totalizing motives of the aggressive DPS, that helps. But I think there is equally, on the incentives of the demand side, the business actors' growing imperative to signal their collective loyalty to the DPS, and reasons being ideological and economic. In the ideological line, electoral legitimacy deficits, or perhaps, to me, more important is to regimes' incentive to reinforce the ideological hegemony over the society. The regime has opted for strengthening political ideological groups over civil society groups, and the dominant incentive of the business community at present is to pack office bearers of the forums with individuals ideologically accepted by the regime. And the economic reason has got to do with the nature of rent allocations by the state. During the CPS phase, rents to a large extent shared across the political divide. Also, non-partisan business individuals could also access rents by deploying conflict strategies. But such practices to a considerable extent have become largely dysfunctional with the advent of the current DPS, and the partisan consideration now increased the influence in the nature of political elites dealing with the market actors. So the changes that have taken place, the bipartisan strategy of the association not only is largely irrelevant, but politically risky. Next one, please.
Mr. Hassan, you have 2 minutes left.
Oh my God. So I shouldn't even start this, because this is a chain of thought. I will stop, but let me just cover these 2 slides. I wanted to do the relationship between state and the unorganized poor. And what we found that the Bangladesh, the relation between state and the amorphous citizen is the relationship between the patron state. 61% people saying this, look at state as a patron. Only 31% consider the state as the representative. Government of people, again, which cares for the people, provide assistance, and so on, and the other factors, what I call negative liberty, promotes political freedom, elected people's votes, so on. These are not taken by people very seriously, but the positive liberty dimension. Positive liberty meaning essentially state will promote and nurture liberty through socioeconomic means. The negative liberty state, what state should not do to promote and nurture people's liberty. Allowing people for freedom of speech and so on. Next one, let me try the next one, and then I think I'll have to stop. The legitimacy, state continues to have legitimacy. We have seen from the previous surveys and the recent surveys. In politics, less legitimacy. In economic and social domains, continuing legitimacy. Reasons being people are more interested in the economic, social and economic development factors, less interested in political factors. So again, the positive liberty trumps over the negative liberty. Biggest problem in the country, it has the same trend. Political traction of positive liberty, citizens want MPs to be development agent rather than lawmaker, and so on. So that has created a state-society relations in the language of game theory, self-enforcing social, economic, political equity.
Your time is up. So
okay, fine. I'll stop here. I hope I'll be able to come back and reflect on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, for an interesting presentation on a very complex issue. Perhaps Dr. Naomi Hussain would like to comment on the paper. She has 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to CPD and Cornell for inviting me. And thank you so much for inviting me to comment on Dr. Mirza Hassan's paper. Mirza Hassan and I, most of you won't know this, we work quite closely together and have done for 15 or more years. And so I wasn't surprised by anything I found in this paper, but I do have the advantage over everyone here, which is that I've actually read the paper. It's a very long paper, it's a very brilliant paper, and it really does, in a quite dramatically clear way explain the dynamics of state-society relations in Bangladesh over the 50 years. So I'm really looking forward to being published so everyone else can read what I have read. That said, I had a few points and areas where I thought it would be interesting for Dr. Mirza Hassan to extend or to expand on, or where I thought there were perhaps gaps that could be filled. So I'll focus on those. The first one is that the paper strikes me as methodologically nationalistic in a way that is not really warranted by the global nature of Bangladesh, by the open nature of Bangladesh. The fact that it has, in its early years at least, international involvement was very important in the liberation struggle. It was very early on dependent on international aid. It has very, very open markets. Global trade is very important, of course, and all of these international factors inevitably impinge upon national politics. And recently we've been hearing a lot about the changing geopolitical strategic significance of Bangladesh, with the rise of China. And I think if that is true, if Bangladesh is suddenly going to acquire some geopolitical significance, which it has lacked for 50 years, that will change the dynamics of state and society relations. So I think we should hear more about that from Mirza Hassan. The second point really is that this very important theoretical framework that Mirza has been developing over the last 10 years around partyarchy, about the concentration essentially of political power in a single party. I think that there's a sense in which that this has clearly become dysfunctional for the goals of the ruling party. And the goals of the ruling party are essentially growth and development in order to show the public that they are legitimate because they are providing what Mirza Hassan describes as positive liberty. Positive liberty is being able to eat and turn the lights on and get healthcare and so on. But we saw in particular, I think, during COVID, how the partyarchy has become quite dysfunctional for those goals. So I think the best example given in the paper, which wasn't discussed in the presentation, was how the Bangladesh Medical Association and Shochib, the politically aligned doctors association, they essentially were quite happy and willing to sacrifice doctors, frontline doctors, to the pandemic rather than criticize the government for not supplying PPE and so on. So I think it's clear that there's a point at which partyarchy, which a dominant party system, is no longer functional for the goals of that dominant party. And I think we saw that during the pandemic. The third one, and this was really brilliant, and I think Mirza Hassan is a very astute observer of this change over the last 50 years, is the way NGOs have changed in Bangladesh, the role they have played in mediating state-society relationships. And I would say, this is not exclusive to Bangladesh. This is an international phenomenon. The changing of civic space, I would say, more than the closing. Civic space has changed in Bangladesh more than it has closed. But nevertheless, the NGOs, the development NGOs, which we spoke so much about in the 90s and the early 2000s, they're a declining force in all sorts of ways for all sorts of reasons. I think we are increasingly recognizing that development NGOs really are a relic of a particular moment of high aid dependence and the post-Cold War, if you like, peace dividend. And they no longer really have that salience, but I think it is something we need to ask about in Bangladesh, given that we have had such impressive and such important NGOs. What are the legacies? What are the institutional effects? And I think there are some hints in this paper in the area of the way local government is being arranged in Bangladesh. And I think that it seems to us, and I always refer to Professor Zahir Ahmed from Jahangirnagar University, who said to me once, if you look at the local government in Bangladesh, government has become an NGO. He says the way government deals with its citizens, the way government engages with its citizens, they've been learning from the NGOs. They've essentially displaced the NGOs through these war dramas and these Utan Boytok and all of these ways of enabling participation, invited participation, but nevertheless participation. The final area I think that we want to all talk much more about is if you like, non-elite citizens. And Mirza Bhai spoke about labor and wrote also about labor and the challenges of labor organization in Bangladesh, which I think we understand really well, the nexus, if you like, between the political elites and the business class, make it essentially impossible for workers to organize. And again, this is almost dysfunctional for the future of the industry, a future which depends on moving up the value chain, which it depends on increasingly high quality rather than cheap labor in the economy. So it's one area I think we still continue to need to understand much better in the political science and political sociology of Bangladesh. But also there's a question, and this is also dealt with very nicely in the paper, not so much in the presentation, that the way in which ordinary citizens view the state, their expectations of the state, what we like to call the moral economy. What are the limits to what the state must do, and what are the things for which the ordinary citizen holds the government accountable. I would like to see much more about that, particularly as we head into an era of even more global financial and economic crises, health crises as well, pandemics, but also of climate change, an issue at which Bangladesh still continues to be at the very front line of changes, of challenges. So what do citizens expect from their dominant party state, I think, is a really good and important question. But I just want to say thank you so much, Ms. Zohei. It was a really excellent paper. I look forward to seeing it published soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
20 seconds earlier.
Oh. Congratulations, Dr. Hussain.
Do I get a prize for that?
Yes, you do. You do. Thank you, Dr. Hussain, for very pertinent comments and questions, and for remaining within the time limit. Dr. Hassan, you may want to respond to her questions and comments. You have 4 minutes.
Okay.
Harad, what I think would be useful is if after all, because there may be some audience Q&A, and if maybe all the speakers respond at the end of Q&A, I don't know. This is my suggestion, because there could be some questions for Mirza even at the end. But it is up to you to decide how you want to handle this.
I thought this would make it more immediate and more fresh. And
okay, all right.
So
should I go ahead? Okay. Methodological nationalism, yes, of course. But my discussion of the trade union will bring in my paper is not complete yet, the role of international trade unions, the connection, the linkages, with the supply chain, different kinds of stakeholders, and the local trade unions, and the different divisions. So, you know the stuff very well. You're the expert in this area. But definitely, I'm going to bring it. I'm going to bring it to make it more internationalist methodologically. And also, when I talk about the state and NGO, I have brought to a certain extent the role of donors in it, how donors, killed a lot of things in Bangladesh, the Shamatas, and a lot of other things, very well. So yeah, that's going to come. So it's not entirely methodologically nationalist as of yet, but it's going to be more internationalist, I promise. And the moral economy, I end with this. You have read it. The way I have posited the relationship between the ordinary people, the popular classes, and the state in the context of the management of lockdown, where I've used strategic, strategic interactions in the line of game theory, and I think that helps. That helps, incentives, bargaining, and so on. But these are all underpinned, which I couldn't do it. I mean, that was my last slide, the concluding slide, all my bloodless language of equilibrium and strategic transactions, everything has tremendous limits, because I need to bring in, at the end of the day, the discursive. I think of just this, the reason that Bangladeshi ordinary people had to fend for themselves, and the government didn't give them any social protection or relief adequately, and they had to only demand that, let us allow to work, okay, since you're not giving us relief. That wouldn't have happened. This equilibrium we wouldn't have reached if there was a radical social, political institutions in Bangladesh backing up the ordinary people, both at the discursive level and both at the political level. So definitely, yes, my game theoretic, bloodless language and conception should be definitely complemented by discursive and other elements. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Have
Thank
I,
you so much.
Famida, any surplus seconds for me here?
Unfortunately, no.
No, okay, I'm glad. All right.
He was hoping to collect interest on that.
Right. I was being strategic.
May I now request Professor Ali Riaz to present his paper? Thank you, Dr. Riaz.
Thank you, Arabai, for this opportunity. Thank you to CPD and Cornell for allowing me to speak. 14 minutes, as we have already seen, is very limited time to present a long paper, but I will try my best. I talk about Islamist politics in Bangladesh and try to look into the past 50 years, also look at the trajectories. The way I've divided this into three major areas, that is the nature and the scope and the trajectory. When I say Islamist politics, which interchangeably used as political Islam, I defined or used the term used by Muhammad Ayub, a form of instrumentalization of Islam by individuals, group, and organization that pursue political objectives. Here, it makes a very clear distinction between the politics and the theological aspect of the religion, often which is convoluted in many discussions. But I'm not limiting myself only within the political parties, as I have seen, as Andrew Mark has rightly pointed out, that we need to see the Islamist politics in a broader term. That is, we need to look at the state-directed policies, but also ideological trend, which remains a very pertinent issue, whether it is by the political party or not. And that is why, as I look into the movements, that is political movements, ideological trends, state-directed policies, I have examined in my paper two sets of actors in the political Islam or Islamist politics. They are political parties and the social organization. Islamist politics, one other thing that is often misunderstood, is seen as a top-down policy or top-down effort, and that has been the case with respect to Bangladesh, particularly the conventional wisdom seems to, and I said erroneously, point to 1975 or 1976 as the beginning of Islamist politics in Bangladesh. I will take a serious departure from there, and I would insist that it is not. So with that, I start with the nature question. In case of Bangladesh, the movements in 19th century, such as Faraizi movement, Tariqa Muhammadiyya movement, or Tayyuni movement, all these things, despite the fact that they have dissipated in the early 20th century, it has remained latent and dormant and has continued to play a part in the public psyche and the political elements of the Bangladeshi society. In 20th century, these things have died down, but at the same time, what happened in Bangladesh is the expansion of the Deobandi movement, particularly the establishment of Deoband Madrasa in Chittagong in 1902, practically 1901, and then it started to flourish in 1902. But at that point, we have seen that the Deobandi tradition and the tradition of those which I'm referring to as the Faraizi movement, Tariqa Muhammadiyya and Dawni movement, all these things have remained within at least two political parties. In case of Bangladesh, particularly in the eastern part, that has remained very foreign. What are those? The Jamaat Ulema Islam or Jamaat Ulema Pakistan, that is JUP, and the Nizam Islami. Both of these political parties have remained very significant because, as we have seen in 1969, for example, when the combined opposition was created, COP, which included the Awami League, of course, as the standard bearer of the nationalist movement, and at that point, it also included Nizam Islami and Jamaat Islami as well. So what happened in the 20th century with respect to the political landscape or the nature of the Islamist politics is that it transformed in 1941 with the rise of Jamaat Islami. So what we have witnessed in 1941, the Jamaat Islami has shifted the landscape. Up until that, we have seen Islamist politics, the standard bearer of Islamist politics was largely coming from the Deobandi tradition, such as Nizam Islami. But Jamaat Islami, which actually expanded and shifted the focus, as opposed to the social Islamization, Jamaat Islami had a very clear and unequivocal stance with respect to the change of Islamist politics. Their idea was that it should be state-centric, top-down, creating a political order through the state. That has been the case, despite the fact that Jamaat Islami did oppose the Pakistan movement in post-1947. They did move into Pakistan and became a political party. However, in case of East Pakistan, then East Pakistan, between 1947 and 71, Jamaat-e-Islami has not succeeded in making any major mark with respect to the Bangladeshi politics or East Pakistan politics for several reasons. One of the major reasons is this, that the nationalist movement, the Bengali ethnic nationalist movement started to begin, and also the expansion of the middle class. And given that it has been a shifting social scenario or scene, so to speak, that has not given Jamaat Islami much of a space. Yet, they remain very much a potent force in case of 47-71 period. But then again came 1971, the War of Independence, and the heinous crimes that was committed by the Pakistani, and the genocide that was committed, and the support by the Jamaat Islami has practically diminished any influence that it could have. The rest of the thing of the political history that we know, that Jamaat Islami emerged in 1976. I think 1976-77 has very important element, not because simply Jamaat Islami emerged, but two things happened at that point that are very significant. One thing is in 1976, when the then Ziaur Rahman regime started the political parties registration act. Jamaat Islami did apply for a license, but they didn't get it. So what it did in 1976, they created practically with two other political parties, including Islamist. That is the important thing. Here we have seen very tactical move by Jamaat Islami, which is going beyond its common or previous position and aligned with Nizam Islami to create Islamic Democratic League, the emergence of idea. And then the second thing is, of course, we know the removal of the secularism from the constitution in 1977. Both of them actually created the Islamist situation for Islamist politics. Most importantly, in 1979, Jamaat Islami emerged as their own political party. But that being said, I think the watershed moment with respect to Islamist politics in Bangladesh is 1981. I understand everyone is going to take taken aback with this. In 1981, and I say 1981 because the establishment of Khilafat Andalan. Khilafat Andalan was the first attempt in independent Bangladesh where we have seen the Deobandi tradition, and particularly those which has carried forward the tradition of the, say, for example, the Tariqa Muhammadiyya and others. They have come together and put a platform, Khilafat Andalan. And most importantly, their representative, Mr. Hafiz Huzur, actually participated in election, didn't get much of a traction with respect to the popular vote. That it clearly sent a message to those who were attached to, related to the ulama, those who were part of this Deobandi tradition, and particularly a long tradition. They thought that they can actually merge with the political one. So previously, what Nizam Islami, or for that matter, Jamaat Ulama Islam or Jamaat Islami Pakistan couldn't, they have succeeded in doing that. So by 1981, we have seen in Islamist politics, in terms of its nature, clearly two strands have emerged. One is represented by Jamaat Islami itself, which is largely urban-centric, but has some support and presence in the rural areas, but doesn't represent the traditional, conventional ways of Islamization. Instead, it has a very state-centric, top-down political project. That is what happened, and subsequently we have seen this transformation or the change in the nature of the Islamist politics. In my paper, I have divided them into five categories. One is the pragmatist opportunist. I put Jamaat Islam into that category. And then the second one is the idealist or orthodox, that this ulama tradition that we know, that is the idealist one. Then we have Peer and Mazar centric. For example, Zakir Party is one to mention. Then we have this urban elite, that is Hizb ut-Tahrir, that has emerged in 2000 and henceforth. And of course, the fifth one, for want of a better word, I have used jihadis. But the point is this fragmentation of the Islamist politics have created a situation where we have seen the proliferation and the dramatic changes in terms of the nature of the politics. And here, one of the things is worth noting that today, if we check the Bangladesh Election Commission, almost 1 in 4 registered political party is an Islamist political party in Bangladesh. Let me make it very clear. Out of 39, 10 is Islamist political party. So you can see the proliferation of Islamist party, a fragmented political scene in Islam. But however, in these instances, on the one hand, we have the Jamaat Islami, on the other hand, is this Nardi. So this is the change, this is the transformation of the last 50 years of Islamist politics. I will come back to, if I have time, to the other points. The scope part, what is happening. Usually, we talk about Islamist political parties. As I've done already with respect to Jamaat Islami, Jamaat Ulama Islam, Hafiz Huzur's political party. But I think that there are society-oriented Islamic movements which has an enormous influence on the Islamist politics in Bangladesh. What do they want, actually? If we look at the Islamists that I'm talking about with respect to these Islamic social movements, they want to create a new identity which puts Islamic identity or Muslim identity at the forefront. They want to change the social norms. They want to talk about the daily practices, gender role, consumption habit, even governance. All these things that we have seen, this agenda, this clear agenda. And here, I'm not talking about top-down, state-centric transformation. I'm talking about from the bottom up. And this is where the Hifazat Islam's emergence should be looked into. Hifazat Islam should be viewed within this context, the Islamization of society from the bottom up, through the change of the construction of new identity. That is what it is. Often the media seems to be overwhelmed by a date. What is the date? January 19, 2010, with which mostly everyone seems to start that Hifazat Islam started at that very day. I'm not underestimating the importance of this enormous meeting that took place in Hatazari Madrasa and the leadership of Mr. Shafi. What I'm saying that this is just one of the 4 attempts of the Bangladeshi Islamists who have a clear Islamization or social Islamization agenda. The first thing is, of course, which I mentioned about 1981, the rise of Mr. Hafiz Huzur as a candidate and coming together under Khilafat on the road, and then expanding further. The second thing was, in 1990, when the Islamic Oikojot emerged. If we look at the composition of Islamic Oikojot, what do we see? We see that most of these have come from the madrasas.
You have 2 minutes left.
Sorry for taking that. Then the third one was the 2007 and 8 against women's policy. That is what eventually turned out to be the 2010. Last, if you give me 1 more minute, the trajectory, what is going to happen? I think that there are 3 elements that would actually shape the future of the Islamist politics. One is the state and ruling party. Increasingly, what we have seen is that by pushing away the Jamaat Islami, the space has been created for this conservative, orthodox Islamist tradition that I have referred to. They are going to expand further. Why I can explain, mostly I would say because of the state, I'm not only talking about the ruling party, state support for these conservative elements. The second element is that the broad political spectrum, less democratic space would give them more space and influence of this orthodox, traditional, conservative Islamists, which we have seen in case of Hifazat and other political parties. And the third one is the mode of Islamization of society. What we have seen is the presence of these tele-evangelicals, so to speak. That is all those we have seen, the wars that we keep on seeing in the YouTube and others, where millions of people are viewing and being, if not indoctrinated, at least their habits are changing, their preferences are changing. Those are the trajectories that I see. I can go on that if I get another opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. You saved 25 seconds.
We will give it back to you, Riaz. Don't worry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Riaz, for a very bold and provocative paper. I completely agree that 14 minutes is very inadequate, but such are the realities. Would Professor Habibul Haq Khandakar please provide his remarks? You have 7 minutes, Habib.
Thank you, Harar Bhai, for giving me the opportunity. Now, I want to limit my remarks to the following points. Point 1, I titled Religion and Society. Rather than revisiting the long history of secularization and desecularization I would only quote my teacher, Roland Robertson, who was a sociologist of religion and globalization. According to Roland Robertson, quote, religion cannot return to national politics because it never left. Religion has become, he continues, a major vehicle for the expression of national identities. Globalization facilitates both the mobility and mobilization of religious identities. So in other words, those who were looking at secularization as a process, that would be universal, they are sort of daydreaming even in Europe, in North America. In North America, in the United States, religion was transformed into civil religion, on which Robert Bellah has written extensively. Now, what this paper does and what I do here, paraphrasing Mark Antony, I come here not to praise Ali Riaz, but at the same time, I'm not here to bury him. I'm here as a true friend, and what friends do, they try to find some shortcomings, and that's what I have taken myself for this 7 minutes. This is a paper of absolutely great promise. And the strength of the paper is taxonomy. That's a very, very powerful contribution to this paper that paper has made. The paper's narratives are both useful and insightful. There are a lot of new grounds that he has covered. Now, what can I then say other than these words of praise and say, okay, my time is up? No. There are certain narratives that Ali Riaz should look at more closely. And later on, I will give my own framework. If I could do a research on the subject, that's the framework I will adopt. Now, the narrative part, when it comes to Pakistan, the narrative is incomplete. Yes, Jamaat did not support Pakistan. That's absolutely true. Although it was formed in 1941, one could expect that a country that is coming to emerge in the name of Islam, a protagonist of Islam, Jamaat Islami, should support it. It didn't. And it didn't support for various reasons. I think it would be useful to look into those reasons. There could be theological reasons, the same reason for which Orthodox Jews do not support Israel, because they think God cannot just create a particular land for the Jews. The whole world belongs to the Jews. And I think Jamaat had that kind of vision, that whole India belongs to the Muslims, and there would be future conversion, again, daydreaming, and so on. And part of the involvement of Jamaats in politics, right from the very beginning, he touches on. But I think Shahabuddin's article covers that point very well. So the point is that if Pakistan was created on the basis of, or using the tool of, using the slogan of Islam, why in the initial days Islam took a backseat? Now, Ali Riaz writes, and I quote, Islam as a mobilizational tool outlived its purpose as soon as Pakistan was created. Now, this is the toolkit model, which really is something that needs to be interrogated, because you cannot use religion as a toolkit. You could use some other slogan as a toolkit, as a publicity gimmick, but not religion, because once this is like opening up the Aladdin's, whatever, the genie would come out, you cannot just bottle back the genie. So once you use Islam, this is something that really needs to be looked at seriously. And again, in that, so this is the most instrumentalist view of Islam. And yes, for Mr. Jinnah, it could be an instrument, but for the entire society, for millions of Muslims who lived in Pakistan, East and West Pakistan, this was not an instrument. You see, just think of the plebiscite that took place in East Bengal in 1946. The Muslims of East Bengal, they voted in large numbers for Pakistan. So this was not an instrument. This was really that there was some ideological affinity. And I think we're still, going through a hangover effect of that ideological affinity.
You have 2 minutes left.
to call it an instrument or tool is something that really needs to be re-examined. Then using that instrumentalist approach, Ali Riaz also looks at Bengali nationalism as a tool for the Bengali nationalist elites. I think we really need to re-examine that. Now, at the end of the day, how do we look at Islam? Should we look at Islam in Bangladesh politics as something very special or part of a global trend? And I would say this is a global trend. And in order to capture that, we really need to use a framework, not just state-centric or society-centric. We need to go to the individual mind. And these are the two levels which have been clearly outlined in Aristotle, the Nicomachean ethics, how individual creates his world or her world, and then how state-centric and state society would come together. So that's one level, and the micro level would be shaping of individual minds. So that would be my framework, and one really needs to look at. So reading Quran, the changes in dresses, in attire, the sartorial revolution that has taken place, all these things would have profound impact on how individual mind changes. And we live in a great time of contradiction. We want our children to be good Muslims, but we also want them to find good jobs in American computer industry and so on. So we live between two worlds, and this is where we need to probe further to look at the individual psyche and how that individual psyche is transforming and being contemplative, being more religious, more spiritual, whatever way it's going. We really need to find that in greater depth. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Habib, for your very relevant comments. Riaz, you can respond to them. You have about 4 minutes or so.
Thank you. Thanks to Habib Bhai for pointing to some of the weaknesses of the paper. First of all, this paper was not in any way trying to set it in the secularization thesis understanding. I never mentioned, I would not have argued that Islam, or for that matter, religion, never went away. The modernization, the way it tried to push it, but that's a different discussion, and I didn't go into this paper because it was not supposed to be. My goal here was just to lay out the Islamist politics or political Islam over the last 50 years. The context of 1947 was just as a background to it, so that we can see in the past 50 years how it has proceeded and what are the trends. Here I have tried to challenge the conventional wisdom, so to speak, with respect to this statist idea that everything started somewhere on a particular date, on a particular moment in the history of Bangladesh in the 1970s. Instead, my argument was that there is a long tradition, which in some ways, Habib's arguments is, puts meat into it or flesh into it, that it has never gone away, with respect to instrumentalization, that is the frame I have used. I have laid out that when I talked about Islamist politics, where I described and used among the youth's argument that instrumentalization of Islam is by individual groups, and those are the things that I've looked into. Thanks for the taxonomy thing. There are a few other elements I wish we could go into. What prompted this Islamist politics or political Islam in Bangladesh? Here, the second thing that I've tried, most importantly in my understanding, is that taking away it from the narrow notion of politics. So to say that as if the Jamaat Islami is the only representative political Islam. In this respect, not only I have gone beyond these, and I think it is important to understand that there are other political parties, and there's a clear two strands of Islamist politics in Bangladesh, if not more. I mean, I haven't talked about the Hizb ut-Tahrir and others, but definitely with respect to the conservative /orthodox tradition and the Jamaat Islami has remained the two major trends. That needs to be. But beyond that, that is the point that I'm trying to make, Hifazat Islam is situated at the intersection of these political parties and the social movement. That's why what we have seen is that Hifazat's rise, often, the media is confused as to what to say about it. Is it Islamist movement or is it Islamic movement? Is it actually a social movement? Is it a political party? No, it is not a political party, but its agenda is very clearly political. Since its discussion in 2010, have been insisting on this. They do not call Hifazat Islam as a non-political one. In 2010, in many media, both Bangladeshi and international, have tried to put Hifazat Islam as if it is a non-political thing, a political force which claims to demand of changing not only behavior on the one hand, but also the constitution cannot be simply considered as a non-political movement. So the intersection of these, that is what I'm trying to highlight. And that's why some of the things in my paper, I have also talked about how the differences of maslak, between Deobandis and the Barelvis and the Al-Ahdis and Ahmadi community actually has influenced thanks to you, what you said about the mind, changing this behavior, changing this mindset of it. The international context
4
can be
minutes
brought
up.
in. International context can be brought in, which is a significant one, but this is precisely looking at the very domestic elements of it. That's what I've tried. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Riaz. Thank you so very much. The final paper of the evening will be presented by by Professor Harold Engelson-Rood. Dr. Rood, would you please do us the honor?
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you in particular to Professor Ronak Jahan for the invitation. I'm greatly honored, of course. I would also like to say that I am Norwegian. I once went to a conference of historians on some aspect of Norwegian history, and there were these foreigners talking about Norway and Norwegian history, and I felt a bit upset. So what do they know? And I would, ask you, I feel extremely privileged to be here. I also feel that I don't quite deserve it, but I will ask you for your time and for your patience, and please forgive me for the intrusion. Now, I have been forth and back to Bangladesh over the last quite a few years. I first went, I think, in 1988, when there was this mobilization against the autocrat. And then again in possibly 92, 93. And one of the things I remember from that time was the struggle between some student unions at Dhaka University, because we stayed a lot at Dhaka University, student unions, and in particular Chhatro League, against Shibir and the violence of it, which struck me as something really peculiar. And I've been interested, a bit curious about this violence and physical form of political expression that I saw then and I have seen later. And I'm sort of trying to, so my presentation here today is a bit coming from that point of view, but also trying to understand quite the nature of the Bangladeshi state as it is today. And I think that perhaps me as a foreigner can add a perspective to that might be interesting. Who knows? So I think that so one of the things, another thing, of course, with violence that you've seen today is that there's the ongoing election to the Upajala, to the UP elections, the several phases, and a lot of violence in that context. I think one report said 25 people have been killed. And one of the interesting things about that, of course, we don't know exactly, but previously people who have engaged in forms of violence and also physically forced an election outcome even outside of the ruling party, have later been admitted back in. And there is a tendency perhaps to condone physical violence. Now, this becomes interesting when we turn to the definition of a modern state. So the classical definition of a modern state focuses precisely on this thing with physical force and violence. Max Weber's definition is that the modern state is a community that claims monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within its territory. Now, this physical force can be delegated to police, or it can be delegated to other institutions, but ultimately it belongs to a central sovereign, and that central sovereign could be the people. And one expression of this particular kind of understanding of the modern state is, of course, this defund the police movement that you've seen some of it in the United States, in which even when the legitimate use of physical force is delegated to a force, to the police, it can be withdrawn. Now, to my mind, this is too simple a measurement. Claims of monopoly or legitimate use of physical forces within its territory becomes too simple a measurement, because if you do not have that monopoly, then you're not fully a modern state according to the definition. But to my mind, that is the case in a lot of different states all over the world. And my point would be that there are very many different ways of not being a fully modern state. There's so very many different ways in which this criteria is not fulfilled. And I think we are somehow helped in this respect by the American political scientist Robert Dahl, who in his investigation of a municipality in the US acknowledges that even the US is not completely a democracy. This is slightly different from the Weber definition, because it doesn't focus on violence as such, or physical force. It focuses on participation and the ways in which they can contribute to the state. Robert Dahl acknowledges that even the US is not a perfect democracy, because not everybody has the same amount of power. They don't have the same kind of influence, right? So instead, he introduces the term polyarchy, which he defines as a modern approximation to democracy. Democracy doesn't exist in its pure form. Instead, we have something we can call polyarchy, which is a situation in which there are a great many people who have power, but a great many people also do not have power, or not the same amount of power. The rich have more power than the poor. The white in the US have more power than the black, etc. And also there are people with different stations in the state. Some have institutional positions that give them a lot of power, and others have less. A journalist has substantially more power, for instance, than a plumber, even though they earn more or less possibly the same amount of money, and they have the same amount of education. So Dahl introduces the term polyarchy, and one thing that he underlines with polyarchy is that they prefer persuasion, but they can also rely on coercion. Of course, a modern democratic state has taxes, fines, prisons, etc. Now, I propose for the case of Bangladesh that we use the term polycracy instead. So cracy comes from the Greek word kraitos, which is the name for the impersonation of strength. And this allows us to identify a state form that relies less on persuasion and more on coercion. Now, there was supposed to be a PowerPoint presentation here, possibly. That went away. Anyway, I'll just read that. I could hold them up like this. Anyway, so in the literature on the post-colonial world, in particular, there is a lot of recent interest in what has been called vernacular democracy, or in caciquismo, which is a term taken from Latin American studies. Violent entrepreneurs. Sistema is a term taken from Russian studies. There's interest in how middlemen operate and how middlemen and local leaders constitute a different kind of state. In a anthropological summary of literature on sovereignty, Finns Deputat and Thomas Bjørn Hansen points out that there are different registers of sovereign power in different post-colonial states. This could be expanded to colonial to metropolitan states as well. And in the case of Bangladesh or South Asia, I think it would be interesting to look at some of the literature from anthropologists on politics in South Asia and the kind of networks or trust networks they have identified for local politics. For instance, there is a very interesting book, an article, a collection of articles by Bosu, Wood and Devine, in which they point out, and I think this sort of refers to the question that Ronak Jahan also pointed out earlier. Are there real differences in political setup across regime types in Bangladesh? And Bosu, Wood and Devine says that there are that a lot of politics happen in dark places, and these dark places are basically a form of large factional agglomerations of patron-client favors and loyalties that exist irrespective of regime type. And to my mind, this rings true to some extent, but I would also suggest that there is a historical development in how these large factional agglomerations of patron-client favors and loyalties have evolved over the various regime types. These are not static. These are not static. So my paper, once it's ready, will draw on material from Borishal in the south of the country. I'm not going to talk now about this material for several reasons, partly because the paper hasn't been done yet. It's a draft.
You have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. Oh, I have 5 minutes on mine. And partly because there is because it's being recorded and there are ethical and GDPR concerns here. So my point would be that there are 4 phases to the development of physical force and politics in this region. The first phase, which is the first years of Mujibur regime, you saw armed groups, Bahinis, armed government forces answering to local leaders, but also marauders, a lot of smuggling, extortion, and robberies. and a revolutionary movement called the Shor-Bohara. The second phase is a phase in which these various forms of political or violent movements are being co-opted into a political system. This is a system, this is a time from 75 to 90 when two new big political parties are being established in order to counter the presence of Army League. And they recruit local toughs, individuals willing to fight, gangs of criminals, and provide them with political protection. In the third phase, which is the democratic electoral era, this again evolves even further. Toughs, gangs of criminals, and activists engaging in violence, physical force, are used against political rivals, Army League against BNP, etc. Bert Soykens and Ainul Islam have identified 14,000 events, out of which 2,400 were lethal. Okay, I'm sorry about my absolutely horrible timekeeping, but you know the sequence. And in the fourth phase, there is no real opposition, and we still have violence being perpetrated between members of the same political party, and in the Borishal case, also against members of the state, representatives of the state. There has been a harnessing of physical force in Bangladeshi history by political parties. And this has been channeled, but it has not given rise to a state monopoly. There is a discretionary use of physical force that is dispersed in localities to individual leaders. And I propose the term polycratic in order to identify the case of the situation of numerous nodes of political power yielding physical force as one among several tools. এ বলে আমি আমার বক্তব্য শেষ করলাম। আপনাদের সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ।
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Rood. Not bad at all for a foreigner. To comment on it, can I request Professor Philip D. Oldenburg to talk about this? Dr. Oldenburg? Dr. Oldenburg?
Oh, I'm sorry, I unmuted myself so that since you didn't hear my phone calls coming. I'm going to read, hoping to keep to my 7 minutes. Thank you for the opportunity, and particularly the opportunity to read the very interesting paper and hear the presentation of Professor Rood. I confess to an ignorance of the details of Bangladesh politics, and it's a fault which I cannot remedy because I don't know Bangla, and I don't think I will learn it at this point, since it's 50 years from the time that I could have chosen to learn it and didn't. So it's unlikely to change, and it does matter. I'm going to miss the nuances, I think, from not being immersed in Bangla sources. We have here another in the series of articles by Rood that draw on intense field work from a variety of locales in Bangladesh. Articles that are impeccably researched and, for me, entirely convincing accounts. In particular, I'm convinced that constructing a more general analysis of the core dynamics of Bangladeshi politics requires that we pay attention not just to the dramas of the national arena, Awami League versus BNP, etc., Sheikh Hasina versus Khaleda Zia, etc. I find the description in this paper of the 4 phases of politics in Borishal convincing, and Rood shows that, to quote him, the system as a whole consists of more or less smaller loci of power. In Borishal, physical force is a key skill deployed by politicians and their groups to compete on election processes, and over-resources. And, still quoting, the situation today is one of a severality of actors with discretionary use of physical force to be used against other political rivals, even within the party structure or against state institutions. There are powerful leaders who have the discretionary use of force. In his essay in the book Mafia Raj, which I have used in my classes and so on, Rood notes that some of these, quote, that some of these politicians are, quote, godfathers, who are basically idiosyncratic CEOs of informal, multi-pronged enterprises. And now he is promoting them to the political status of semi-independent rulers in a polycentric political system. If Rood does not mention this here, I don't know. He notes Weber's definition of a modern state, but he says if a state can be said not to have full monopoly on the use of violence within its borders, that state will fall short of this standard definition, Weber's definition, and we are left with an understanding of the state as immature. If, on the other hand, we apply a ground-up approach and as impassionately as possible observe what exists in practice, we might understand and appreciate the current situation rather than pass an ill-considered value judgment. Rood describes cases convincingly, saying, quote, these cases illustrate the polycratic nature of the Bangladesh state. There are numerous nodes of political power, that is, powerful leaders who have the discretionary use of physical force. The use of violence or physical force is not monopolized by the state. And because the use of physical force is condoned by higher authorities as a misunderstanding, it follows that it is part of the daily operation of political life in the country. As such, the state does not claim a monopoly of physical force, but allows individual leaders to use physical force in discretionary ways. I note polycratic. Rood references Robert Dahl's use of the term polyarchy, which is done again, instead of democracy. Polyarchy has had a limited scholarly run, but polycracy is not so blessed. I did a quick checking through the internet kinds of sources that I use, and the handful of references lead far away from Bangladesh and back to Weimar Germany, Nazi Germany, and Schmittian philosophy about this, on this topic when we're talking about polycracy. One source lists 169 words ending in archy or cracy and defines polycracy as, quote, government by many rulers or polyarchy. The field is open, I think, for Rood to propose a more precise definition, but the thing itself clearly exists, whatever the name. I am reminded of C. Wright Mills's The Power Elite, which focused on national level institutions like the military. The focus here is on all powerful institutionalized groups and their leaders at sub-country levels of region and locality, and that's welcome. Naming this the political system they operate in as polycracy might depend on whether one finds similar, perhaps long-established systems in other countries. But how stable is this polycratic system? Can we rule out a renationalization of politics, perhaps by another military coup, or possibly revive national party politics, brought on, say, by a severe, say, climate disaster or some other crisis of that sort? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Oldenburg, for your very useful and very organized comments. Thank you all for some very, very interesting, sophisticated papers and, of course, very thoughtful comments. It is time to open up the discussion and take questions that people may have. This will be organized by Dr. Fahmida Khatun from comments and questions in the chat boxes. Fahmida?
Yes, thank you very much. There have been a lot of questions actually from on the Q&A and also on the chat box. Let me just, I don't know, I'm really lost, but let me try. First, to Professor Ali Riaz, let me just read out a few. Okay, I'll go by the speakers according to. One question is to Professor Mirza Hassan. So this is from someone, Muhammad Musleuddin. So he says that from 2007 to 2008, army rule and the role of army police force totally missing. I will appreciate his elaboration on the issue. And let me go back. Okay, another question to Dr. Mirza Hassan. You talked, this is from Muhammad Nuruzzaman. He says, you talked about CPS and DPS in the context of Bangladesh. It looks like that the DPS is making progress on economic front, though you didn't make any references.
Global reference, I think. Global reference? That's the idea I got.
Let me just, somehow it's gone.
Madam, just look the answered session, answered tab. Go to the answered tab.
How did it go away? The question I was reading now, it just disappeared.
QA, go to QA.
Okay. Okay, another question to Mr. Hassan. By any means suggesting in order to move from DPS to CPS again, we would need to support from the military establishment. This is from Mr. Zahid Rahman. Okay, these are for Dr. Mirza Hassan. Another one, okay. So this question to Dr. Mirza Hassan, you talked about CPS and DPS in the context of Bangladesh. It looks like that the DPS is making progress on the economic front, though you didn't make any reference to DPS model in other countries. Is DPS emerging as a new phenomena or possibly a new model for other countries? So these are some of the questions to Dr. Mirza Hassan. I think he should respond first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I say something, please? I think Dr. Root didn't get any chance to respond to Dr. Oldenburg's comments like the other two panelists.
Yes, well pointed. Yes.
My apologies, Dr. Root.
Dr. Root first respond before you go to Q&A. Thank you.
Okay.
My apologies, Dr. Root. I'm sincerely sorry. I'm embarrassed and sorry.
So we're even now. Okay, that's good. Thank you so much, Dr. Oldenburg, Professor Oldenburg. Excellent comments. I will be quick. I won't take much of the Q&A time here. I think you made some excellent comments. I was just going to ask you this term. I heard poly-elite. Was that a term that you used? And where would I find references on that one? I agree that polycracy is not the ideal term. Some of the literature does point back to Carl Schmitt and in Germany, but some of the literature also points back to the EU. The EU has also been termed a polycratic entity in which there are a lot of entities that decide and have force and power without being democratically accountable. Last question you made, which I think is really interesting, is whether this system is stable, and I think not. It's not. I think there is a lot of tension currently between a central command, a central government that wants to monopolize physical force, wants to monopolize power in the country, and yet finds itself too weak and dependent on all these local power holders for votes and for support. I think it's a fundamentally unstable state. Right now, it looks stable, but so did a lot of the feudal states in Europe. They looked stable for a while before they crumbled. Thank you.
Right. Let me just say that what I said was the C. Wright Mills book, The Power Elite. The Power Elite. I think the problem, the solution for me is to dispense with polycracy and just stick to polycratic, which is, I think, a good in English sounds better.
Thank you, Dr. Oldenburg, and thank you again, Dr. Rood. I apologize to both of you. Can we go back to the questions?
Should I
So
come?
those were the questions. So over to you, Mirza Hassan.
Okay. About this army rule thing, I always consider that as an exceptional period. And, I was thinking in terms of, the political parties, the DPS, the political elites versus the citizens. So the army rule is an exceptional rule. 2007-8 is very, very exceptional. A lot of exceptional things happen. It doesn't fit into the Bangladesh history, political evolution, and so on. For different reasons it does, but not for the purpose that I had in mind. So I avoided it consciously. And the global reference to DPS, of course, DPS is not new. Even the Congress Party at 1947 was DPS, but of a kind of liberal variant, thanks to big push by Nehru. But current DPS are Singapore, China, all the East Asian tigers were DPS for that matter. So they are always efficient economically, but not politically maybe. But what is political efficiency? That's a new question. Then I don't want to get into this. Movement from DPS to CPS needs military. I live in Dhaka. I don't want to comment on that. And there is a question from Qazi Maruf, Professor Qazi Maruf. I know him very well, and he asked a very important question that So I talked about organized civil society. What about the Samaj? Samaj is so important. Yes, Maruf, I have covered that in my paper. Once you read my paper, you'll see there's a particular section on that where I talked about the Wat Sabha and what happened. When poor people starts deliberation with the patron state and how Samaj comes in. So you'll get to know if you read the paper later. Sajjad Zahir Lenin, I don't know whether he's still here. He asked me questions: what is the state? Well, for my state, for me, the state is interchangeably I use political elites and state together. And for a party state, there is no blurring. There is no lines. Lines are blurred. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Mirza. Fahmida?
Yes. Now I would move to the questions for Dr. Ali Riaz. So here, Mr. He asked someone from McMaster University, Canada. So he asked to Professor Ali Riaz, would you be able to provide some insights on Jamaat-e-Islam's interconnections or differentials from the Muslim League in the post-1947 era, a key party that influenced the emergence of a Muslim/Islamic Pakistan? So this is a question from Shamika Shabnam. Then another comment I see this is Rasilul Qadir. He says Islamic politics is wrongly marked with JIB and other Islamic parties, but the major political parties also take resort to Islam to gain popular support in election. It seems that in the soil of Bangladesh, no party can come to power opposing Islam. Now the question is accommodating Islam with the mainstream politics so that we can check extremism and militancy of Islam. So this is kind of a comment. these are the major questions. Another long question. I'll read this out, and then I will hand over to Professor Alias. So this is a question from John Richards. He asked, I have a question to Professor Riaz and also Khundukar. So is there a parallel between the rise of popular support for new Islamist social organizations in Muslim majority organizations such as Hifazat in Bangladesh and the rise of conservative populism in high-income countries? While Bangladesh has realized high growth rates post-2000, income inequality has become more severe. The benefits are overwhelmingly realized in the urban context among those in business and politics. The general interpretation of conservative populism in the global north has largely been explained by an excessive domination of professional urban elites relative to the rural society. In conclusion, is the rise of Islamic politics the new form of rural opposition to the excess of the urban-led dominant politics in our league in particular? So this is a question to Professor. So these are the major questions to Professor Ali Riaz.
Thank you, Famida. Let me try to respond these three things that what I gathered from the questions. First thing is the relationship between GI and Muslim League in post-1947. They have carved out two different spaces, as we mentioned, and as I have discussed, the 1941 Jamaat-e-Islami established in 41, and since then it has not supported this quote-unquote Muslim nationalist movement to establish an independent Pakistan as a Muslim homeland. Hence, there has been a very clear differential or differences between the Muslim League as an organization and JI. And JI's primary target, or at least objective, was in 1941-47 and post-47 period is the transformation of creating an Islamic state. Although an ideal disposition of an Islamic state is open to contest and conversation. So they have ran parallelly, though, and they in reality they have not tried to capture the support base of each other. They've remained completely different pathways. Muslim League started to weaken and dissipate by 52, I would say, practically. It became a ghost of its past. Jamaat-e-Islami didn't expand in the eastern part of Pakistan, that is Bangladesh now, but there have been some support that they have gained in West Pakistan. So these two clear, distinctively different pathways that we see. We can go into the points that time would not allow us to. The second thing that we talked, the question of Islamist politics to overemphasizing Jamaat-e-Islami. There is a reason for overemphasis of Jamaat-e-Islami. There are two. One, that as an organization, unlike others, Jamaat-e-Islami had expanded in post-1979. Though its electoral support has always been limited. Electoral support for Islamist politics has always been limited, and it was in a very interesting manner. And free and fair elections, the support for JI as well as other Islamists have been dwindling over the years. So that is one thing. The Jamaat has been a significant factor in Bangladeshi politics, and it has succeeded in, changing the sides between BNP and Awami League. And that has made, at one point, made it as a kingmaker. That's why it has been overtly and overly emphasized. I understand that one. So I'm not going to completely dismiss that this is not necessary. It was necessary. However, it happened at the expense of the other Islamist forces, and paying not so much attention to it has created this space that we hardly understand this politics of those I described as Orthodox content. Hence, now they have created that space and they're coming forth. As an appendage to that, or as what the question had, that whether the other political parties have made use of it. It is not only for the electoral victories that the Awami League or the Bangladesh Nationalist Party has gone in. It is also to legitimize itself, to give them as a quote-unquote moral standing. Previously, we have seen that as much as the moral legitimacy is questioned, often the political parties have relied on the Islamist party. Final point, I'm not going to monopolize, is rise of Islamist organization in Bangladesh currently similar to or akin to the conservative movement that we have seen in the West. Despite parallels, despite similarities, I don't think they are the similar phenomena. Because in case of Bangladesh, there's a long tradition to it. Of course, in the United States, we have seen this Tea Party didn't come from out of blue. But the point is that it is this notion that it is urban versus rural seems to defeat the purpose or betrays that these political parties, the Awami League and BNP, all actually previously did represent and continue to represent to a large extent the rural population. Is it a class-based difference? That is a more important question to me. I haven't gone into this yet. I hope we'll be able to see whether this is a reflection of the or absence of class-based politics in Bangladesh that has created more space. But definitely it is the state which allowed ruling party has allowed, and particularly over the last 10, 12 years, we have seen how it has been appeased and compromised. Thank you.
There are a few small queries, and these are not particularly for anyone, just common questions maybe anyone can answer. One is Mr. Ali Hassan Nishat. He asked, what is our ultimate goal? To achieve a country like welfare states like these Scandinavian countries? This is one. Then someone has asked that Bangladesh is what type state, he meant that what type of state is Bangladesh. And also someone else, anonymous, asked, are we going to he meant probably, are we going to see a reformed democratic country? Then another question, Jamaat or Communist Party is a catalyst for power in Bangladesh in 5 decades. Then Professor Habib, he made a comment that late Charles Tilley's definition of state will fit better than Weber's definition. So these are some of the comments. And also, so Dr. Ali Riaz, how to explain the way secular parties are including Islamist symbol and narratives in their party activity and state outlets, for example, textbooks. So these are some of the other issues which have been raised. So not to specifically anyone, but you may like to respond. So,
if I may just quickly, okay.
Riaz ki bolchili?
The question that was raised that the mainstream political parties, quote unquote, secular political parties have adopted these Islamic symbols and other things. This is what this Islamization of society has resulted. And the politics of expediency, I would say. We can go into the details, but I am aware of and have written about it previously, that this has been the case in Bangladesh. There is not the Islamist political parties remain on the fringe, but it has become incorporated in the symbols and icons of the quote-unquote secular political parties as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Fahmida, are there any other questions? Or
yeah, there is one to Dr. Rood. So Mr. Zahidur Rahman has asked, Dr. Rood, you say that state has so far failed to monopolize use of force. How can state do that in the context of Bangladesh? So this is to him.
Difficult question.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And also another one to Professor Ali Riaz. What is your marking on the status considering the system of state, society, and politics? So what is your marking on the status of Bangladesh using 1 to 5, even after 50 years of its birth? It will help us feel our position. So one to Dr. Rood and one to Dr. Ali Riaz.
Fahmida, I would recommend not to take any more questions after this. Now, if only Professor Riaz and Professor Rood would like to respond to the questions already raised.
So should I go first? Or
Please.
Ali? Okay, so I'll be quick. I think that there is a tremendous conundrum for whoever wants to see the monopolization of power and physical force in Bangladesh, because the ruling political party is dependent on all of these local power holders. And in a sense, the best way forward in order to harness this physical force would be by increasing the power of the rulers centrally, which could mean a more authoritarian state. And this, of course, is an ideological and ethical dilemma. I'll just add to one of the questions that was raised to Ali Riyad a little earlier about the populist movement in Europe and Islamists in Bangladesh. I've written with a colleague an article that looks at the kind of fundamental or even psychological attitudes behind these two movements, not so much the populist movement in Europe, but the radical right in Europe. And there are strong similarities between certain Islamist groups or support for Islamist groups in Bangladesh and radical right groups in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Riaz, kichu bolbi?
Although at this moment, at this time of the semester, I'm grading my students and putting 1 through 5 or 10, but I would refrain from doing that in such a brief manner on the question of Bangladesh, particularly this session, particularly on the 50th anniversary. So that's where I would stop. Thank you.
Okay.
Arar bhai, can I come in? Just there was a question for me, which basically is asked, I'll be extremely brief. Whether we are still with the intermediate regime or we are a different kind of, coalition. That's a very interesting question. It's a very important question. It's a very confusing stage. I think we are taking off. I mean, going out of this intermediate regime thing, the dominance of the middle class and so on in politics and in society, and possibly moving towards some kind of political capitalism not in the economic sense, but also sociological sense and political sense, meaning a growing trend of state capture by the bourgeoisie, being very, very confident. I have given a completely different picture, but things are changing. I think I can, especially with the bankers, private bankers, you can see there is a movement from class in itself to class for itself. And some kind of political capitalism, I don't know which direction. China doesn't look like the option, but I don't know, it could be a mixture of something completely unique. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mirza, for being so brief. Since we began a bit later on Akappa, I suggest we go forward just a little more, maybe 3-4 minutes. Okay. Thank you all for very, very thoughtful papers and comments. It would be sheer audacity on my part to try to comment on the papers of such esteemed scholars. So I will not do that, but I would like to make some very general observations and perhaps indicate a few areas where a little more attention could probably be helpful. Well, first of all the papers shared several things in common. They were all informed, insightful, and hugely relevant contributions on these issues and deserve our thanks. All the authors and discussants here today are talented, dedicated, and productive scholars. This evening bears testimony to their excellence. Second, all the papers try to identify different phases or stages in Bangladesh's evolution over the last 50 years in terms of the fraught nature of state-society relations, or the steady encroachment of religion in politics, or the variations in the different modalities and expressions of violence, all of which have gradually changed over time. Thus, all the papers engaged in some kind of a periodization of this history and offered various taxonomic schemes with relevant labels, components, and parameters in order to help us organize our thoughts and provide this historical dynamic with some definitional clarity and intellectual orderliness. I did not have any questions, but some suggestions for the presenters, coming from my own prejudices and biases and ignorance. Let me briefly mention some of them to you and not go into details. For example, Mirza, do you think that perhaps you could have explored the role of class, particularly the middle class, in the confusions regarding state-society negotiations, contestations, and mediations? After all, the middle class in Bengal was not an organic class emerging naturally through socioeconomic evolution, education, and professional growth, but artificial formations based on land ownership created by colonial interests and needs after the Permanent Settlement Act of 1793. Riaz, in the context of the increasing presence of Islamist forces today, I was hoping that the international dimension could be fleshed out a little more, given the perceived anti-Muslim sentiments in the West expressed through the wars foisted by them in the Middle East, and the impatience and intolerance supposedly in evidence in some of these countries. Add to that the millions of Bangladeshi workers in the Arab countries being exposed to all these Salafi doctrines, and finally, the attitudes, language, and policies of the current government in India, which may all have encouraged the Islamic mobilization that we see in Bangladesh today. For Professor Rood, I was wondering if the sheer efficacy of violence, after all, it is cheap, easy, effective, and universally understood, created these entrepreneurs of violence. I love that phrasing. And different regimes, instead of trying to control them, simply adopted aspects of it as parts of their political strategies. Is violence the cause of democratic failures or the effect of such erosion? Similarly, does the depth of anger and frustration in the population, which leads to horrific expressions of brutality, such examples are many and chilling today, make it impossible to control violence without addressing the underlying factors that are creating those psychological dislocations and desperations in the first place? I think it is time. It's almost 10 o'clock now. Before we conclude this session, I would like to extend my gratitude to CPD and Cornell for arranging this conference, to the unheralded heroes, especially Avro and his gang, who have remained in the shadows as they worked so diligently to make this complex undertaking possible, to the paper presenters and commentators for enlightening us and provoking us to think, to Dr. Fahmida Khatun for her friendship and her assistance. Without her, I would be lost. And in particular, I would like to thank Professor Rahman Subhan and Ronak Jahan for leading this effort and for allowing me to be part of these proceedings. Thank you all. Thank you so very much. And a very good night to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Recording stopped.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
thanks so much.
I would like to compliment all the speakers, both the presenters and the discussants, for a